Hey there, knitters! Welcome to episode 37 of Knit Talk with a Tech Editor. I'm Megan of the Unapologetic Knitter, and I'm a tech editor. Today, because I'm recording this before the Thanksgiving holiday, even though you're watching it a week later, I thought it would be fun to have a bit less of a structured video and just answer a couple of different questions that I've had come in over the last few months. So these will be slightly less technical, but hopefully some good information that you will enjoy learning with me. And you're going to want to stick around to the end of the episode because I'm going to do a fun little giveaway. So hopefully you'll have fun with me and put your name in the hat for the giveaway. So the first question that I got was on episode 35, so just 2 weeks ago, when I was talking about yarn substitutions. And I gave you two examples of worsted weight yarn, a superwash merino, which is a worsted spun yarn, and a worsted weight yarn, as well as a woolen spun yarn, which is non-superwash and is also worsted weight. So both worsted weight, one is worsted spun, one is woolen spun. And the conversation around these two yarns was whether they would be a good substitute for each other based on their yardage information, their weights, their makeup, etc. So at the end of that particular video, I mentioned that the biggest difference between these two types of yarn is how much they weigh per gram. And I'm not good enough to do the math backwards in my head because I said this was going to be a less scripted video. The original yarn here that I'm talking about is 95 yards per 50 grams. This woolen spun yarn is 140 yards per 50 grams. So it sounds like the two are not good substitutes for each other, but they actually are. And this is why yarn substitution can be so very tricky. There are so many components that go into it. The long and the short of it is both yarns are considered a true worsted weight yarn. If you were to use a US 8 or 5mm needle and knit a swatch in stockinette stitch, your gauge would likely be around 18 to 20 stitches over 4 inches, which is what gives you a worsted weight yarn. Now, because of the way the two yarns are spun and the makeup of them, remember superwash versus non-superwash, the statistics of having 95 yards versus 140 yards over 50 grams can be really confusing. So this is why swatching is so important. And I won't go into all of the details about fiber makeup in this video because I think that's a really big topic that we should look at using for another video. But I wanted to talk about why you might consider these good substitutes for each other and why you might not consider them good substitutes for each other. So a superwash yarn, regardless of the content, although most often it is a merino yarn, you might find merino blends that are superwash. I can't think of another fiber off the top of my head that I have personally used that is superwash that is not merino. But a superwashed yarn is typically coated. It goes through a process that smooths all of the fibers out, so you get less pilling and the fibers are a little bit stronger, so it's heavier. But with that weight and that process that it goes through to smooth it out, the fibers are generally slipperier. I'm not sure if that's the right word I want to use, but they will drape a little bit differently. They're going to hang a little bit differently. So if a pattern calls for a worsted spun, worsted weight yarn, and it's got a lot of structure to the garment, like maybe you've got a lot of seams in it for shoulders at the sides or at the arms, like if you're seaming the shoulders or the sleeves into the arms, a woolen spun yarn can be a really good substitute for that. This yarn, when knit up, is going to have a lot of structure to it, but it's going to physically feel lighter. So if you don't like wearing heavy garments, a woolen spun is going to be a great substitute. So yes, in some cases they can be a great substitute. Where they're not a great substitute, in my opinion, and again, this is just my opinion, by all means feel free to disagree with me, is If you have a garment that is knit at a very loose gauge and it's meant to be kind of holey or drapey, and this is the yarn spec, I probably would not go to this yarn as a substitute, largely because the fibers are going to be stickier, they're going to be physically lighter weight, so it's not going to have that same pulling down of the fabric that you would get with a really smooth, drapier kind of yarn. So a lot of that comes down to just practicing and knowing what the fibers are going to do. If you are working on a sweater, I know I go back to the Weekender by Andrea Mowry very often, but it's a very popular garment. You could use either one of these yarns for that sweater. It's a worsted weight garment that has very little detailing on the main part of the fabric in terms of it's not lace weight, it's not knit at a really open weave, there's not even the density that you might have if you had a really heavily cabled fabric. So both a superwash or a non-superwash woolen spun yarn would be great for that garment. So yes, sometimes they're good substitutes for each other and sometimes they're not. And I know that doesn't give you a definitive answer. I do think this is a conversation we can circle back to at a future date. So for, I believe it was Joan who wrote in about that. Thank you very much, Joan. I will take that comment that you left and put it into a more detailed video so that we can continue that conversation about yarn substitutions. And this is where the first half of today's giveaway goes. Because we're rolling into the holiday season and I always have so much fun with you guys, I thought we should do a giveaway for a skein of this Brooklyn Tweed yarn. This is the Shelter worsted weight woolen spun yarn that we've been talking about. I used this yarn when I designed a hat earlier this year called the Learning Hat. So what I would like to do is give away this skein of yarn and a digital copy of the Learning Hat pattern to the winner. So make sure you stick around to the end to find out what you need to do to be entered in the drawing. Let's now go to the second question that I received. It was on episode 26 where we talked about short rows and how you can use them to alter the necklines on sweaters. And the question was, if you get a target depth of your short rows of, say, 1.75 inches, how do you convert that into the number of rows you need to work? And this all goes back to row gauge. So if you know that you have to knit 1.75 inches of stockinette stitch for your short rows, and your row gauge is, let's say, 20 rows over 4 inches, you're going to take that length, so 1.75, and you're going to divide it by 4 because we measure our row gauge over 4 inches. And then you're going to take that remainder and multiply it by your row gauge. Now bear with me because I didn't do this math ahead of time. 1.75 divided by 4 is 0.43, so just a little bit less than half. And then we're going to multiply that 0.43 by 20 because our row gauge is 20 rows over 4 inches, and we get 8.75. So obviously we can't knit 8.75 rows. However, we can either decide to go slightly less and do 8 rows, or do slightly more and do 9 rows. So when you are planning your short rows for, let's say, a shoulder, and you decide that you're going to do 8 rows just because evens are a little bit nicer, you're going to take your total of 8 rows and divide it in half, which is 4. But because you need a resolution row where you're going to be resolving all of your short rows across your shoulder, you need to subtract 1 from that half. So 8 divided by 2, so half, is 4, minus 1, because we have to have that resolution, is 3. So over those 8 vertical short rows that you're going to work, you're going to have 3 turning points over your span of your shoulder for your short row. So I think that question came from a viewer named Nancy. Nancy, if you still have more questions about that, please leave a comment below this video detailing what other questions you might have about that metric or that conversion, and we can look at explaining that in a future video as well. Okay, so this third question came in as a write-in submission from a viewer named Amy. Thank you, Amy. I know you had lots of points in your emails that you wanted me to cover, but I thought this would be a good quick one that we could talk about in today's episode. So the question was largely, how do I add waist shaping to a boxy sweater? So boxy sweaters are going to be garments that have more than 6 inches of positive ease, and you largely wear them straight down your body. There's not a lot of shaping, if any shaping. And so if you have a tiny waist, you just kind of look straight. And so I get that. As someone who is very curvy at the hips, I actually love a boxy sweater, but I know that's not to everyone's taste. So some of this is going to be opinion-based and some of this will be math. So in my opinion, when you are adding shaping to a garment, like to pull it in at the waist and then go back out for any hips, I think you want to reserve shaping like that on a garment that has 4 inches of positive ease or less. So garments that are going to fit fairly close to your body and therefore might skim parts of your body differently than an oversized boxy sweater, which really hangs straight down your body and doesn't touch any curves of your body. I'm going to say that based on personal experience. I knit a sweater a couple of years ago, actually more than a couple of years ago now. It was when I went to Rhinebeck back in 2018. And I had about 5 or 6 inches of positive ease in this garment, and I added waist shaping by decreasing and then increasing again at the side seams. And it hung so weird. Although mathematically the dimensions were accurate for my body, so I maintained the 5 to 6 inches of positive ease at my chest and as it curved into the body, but it hung differently. I don't even have the right words to say exactly why, other than it was kind of fighting the shape of what the garment wanted to be based on how much ease there was. So again, that's my opinion. If you want to add waist shaping, I would suggest adding it to garments that are smaller, so that are meant to fit tighter to your body. However, everybody's opinion is different, so if you do want to add waist shaping to a garment that is meant to be more boxy, I would recommend taking a look at my video, episode 12, where we talk about adding shaping to a garment below the armholes. There are 2 methods that I discuss in that video. One is adding waist shaping at the side seams, so right below your underarms. And the second method is, I don't remember if I called it the circular method or the conical method, but basically you're adding shaping around the entire circumference of your garment, kind of in rings, so that you're decreasing more than just 4 stitches, 2 at each side. And I think that's going to distribute the shaping for you a little bit better rather than just trying to do it at the side seams. I think the garment wants to compress in and go out rather than taper in and taper back out, if that makes sense. So while that video largely talks about adding shaping to go sort of an A-line shape, so narrower down to a wider, you can use the same principles of figuring out how many stitches you want to increase over a vertical distance. And so you'll decrease down to the depth of your waist from your underarm. So make sure you measure from your underarm to your smallest waist point. Find that vertical measurement. Determine how many stitches you need to decrease over that vertical measurement, and then divide it over a couple of those circular decrease rounds. I think you're going to get better shaping than if you try to do it just at that side seam. And then of course, remember that for your hips, you're likely also going to want to increase back out again. Depending on how large your hips are relative to your chest to waist circumference, you may not need to increase as many stitches back out for your hips as you decreased down for your waist, but keep the same method of increasing those stitches in the rings around the sweater rather than just at the side seams. So I hope that answers your question. As I mentioned, your email had lots of other questions in it, so I have got those tucked away for future episodes, and I'll make sure that we get to those. So here we are at the end of today's fun little video. I hope you enjoyed it. It's a different pace for me, talking about things kind of off the cuff without all sorts of visuals. But let's get to that little giveaway. So for the giveaway, let's talk about what you need to do to be entered in for a drawing to win this skein of Brooklyn Tweed Shelter yarn, along with a digital copy of my Learning Hat pattern. I also need to say this is not a sponsored video whatsoever. This is a yarn that I love, that I had in my stash, that I thought would be a fun little giveaway. It is from a smoke-free but dog-friendly home, which you probably already know if you've been here before. So here's what you need to do to enter the drawing. You need to tell me what's different about what's going on behind me today. If you have been here before, you're probably familiar with what my office looks like, and something is different. In the comments below the video, tell me what you think is different, and for everybody who gets that right, I will throw your name into a hat, and I will pull it on the next week's video so I can send this prize out, and you can have a nice holiday season knitting yourself or someone you love a hat. Thank you so much for joining me this week and all of the weeks prior to this. I hope you are enjoying the winter season and looking forward to a happy holiday season, and happy knitting.